Thank you for joining us this morning, and we'd like to invite anyone who's interested in doing so to join us for a Zoom conversation each Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. You can find the link in the description of this video or iTunes download wherever you access this sermon. And we usually focus on the topic of the day, give you a chance to ask questions, make comments, and interact with the sermon material. So we hope you join us for that. Thank you. It's not a secret that I love studying history. I believe it's a vital discipline for understanding and transforming the world. And as shocking and terrifying as human cruelty has been throughout recorded history, it's also really heartening to observe time and time and time again the movements that inevitably arise to oppose that oppression, to resist it and transform it. This is also important, I think, to remember if you are tempted to excuse the complicity of people in the past by insisting that they were just products of their time. By studying history, we can become more aware of our own responsibilities and the possibilities that exist right here in the present moment. So last week, we started looking at the plight of the residential schools, the terrible tragedy that unfolded in our shared history in Canada and the United States. And I want to return to that this week, but with a little bit more of a historical view and what that might mean for us in the present. One of the most important historical moments in U.S. history, when there were multiple and large movements to either oppose or to work for social justice and change, followed the American Civil War. Optimism that Reconstruction would bring about true and lasting healing and change in a nation ravaged and traumatized by the horrors of slavery and war, combined with optimism that there could be a change in the government's policies regarding Native peoples. President Ulysses S. Grant and the events that took place in his administration are a good starting point and an example of these trends. The Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871, for example, were directly aimed at providing federal support to protect the rights of freed Black Americans and to oppose the Ku Klux Klan. Under the direction of Attorney General Amos Ackerman, hundreds of Klansmen were tried, often by entirely Black juries, and imprisoned. Thousands more received fines or warnings or even had to flee to try to escape prosecution. As a result, the KKK as a formal organization was largely in wreckage by 1872. Some lessons that we might be able to learn from today. At the same time, President Grant wanted to find a different approach to U.S. relations with Native peoples. So he chose to work closely with his longtime friend and colleague, Ely S. Parker, and he made Parker his Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Parker, whose native name was Donehigawa, was a member of the Seneca Nation and the first Indigenous person to ever hold the post of commissioner. Together, they developed policies that, if implemented, would have included providing federal troops to protect reservation borders from settlers, and ultimately would have provided pathways for Indigenous peoples to become citizens. Those plans were vehemently opposed, and they were just consistently undermined. Opponents would even eventually falsely accuse Parker of embezzling money as an attempt to stop the reforms and changes. Parker was exonerated, but Congress then stripped power from the office of Commissioner of Indian Affairs, and Parker resigned in 1871. Plans and relationships continued to fall apart, so that President Grant ended up waging war against the very people he had campaigned on the idea and the thought that he would protect, including the Modoc War of 1873, the Red River War of 1874, and the Great Sioux War in 1876. By 1885, the year that Ulysses S. Grant died, Donehigawa, once Grant's enthusiastic colleague, described the fate of Indigenous peoples in North America. And you will recognize this quote from what we talked about last week. But here's the historical context. Resisting the racist idea that blamed Indigenous people for their troubles, and far removed from his role as a Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Ely S. Parker wrote this: "The disabilities, disadvantages, and wrongs do not result, however, either primarily, consequently, or ultimately from Native Americans' tribal condition and Native inheritances, but solely, wholly, and absolutely from the unchristian treatment they have always received from Christian white people. The tenacity with which the remnants of this people have adhered to their tribal organizations and religious traditions is all that has saved them thus far from inevitable extinguishment. President Grant's campaign slogan had been, "Let us have peace." And he seemed sincere in that vision to reform federal Indian policies. So how did it happen that, as Alyssa Landry has described it, some of the worst massacres and grossest injustices in history occurred while Grant was in office? I think that's a really important question for us to ask if we want to avoid the kind of pitfalls that kept others like Grant and Parker from true healing and change. In Grant's case, central to his failures was the development of millions and millions of acres of federal public lands, combined with the private acquisition of land by pioneers, spectators, and railroad and mining companies, made possible by legislation passed during the Grant's administration, the Timber Culture Act, the General Mining Act, the Desert Lands Acts. All of these expanded the land available to homesteaders and settlers, and guess who paid the price? Native peoples. It was their land. In the end, Grant's hopeful slogan, "Let us have peace," was no match for the reality of expansionism and the greed of settlers. In Landry's words, Grant realized that his expansionist goals required the removal of Indians from desirable land. His Indian peace policy, designed to reform the Indian Bureau and remove corrupt agents, also called for rigorous agricultural training on reservations and establish schools and churches that would transform Indians into Christian citizens. This tension, this is the U.S. setting for residential schools. Even though some people like Grant and Elias Parker wanted to promote and protect the rights of the original nations, that hope was always second place to the relentless Western push of land grabbing and violent displacement. A cluster of ideas have especially supported and justified this kind of colonization. First, the dominating power needs to believe in its own superiority. Members of the dominating society then feel that they are entitled to rule and profit from that superiority. I mean, what's the point of superiority if you can't, make a profit off of it and money and resources and wealth? Even if that profit comes at the expense of others. And that is especially the case when the people harmed are categorized as inferior. They're automatically expendable. Moreover, because the dominating power believes in its superiority, it can then reframe the harm it does to others as ultimately in their own best interest. Because, they reason, those that survive will reap the benefits of being assimilated into the superior culture. It's a tidy system that excused hundreds of years of oppression, and it continues to do so today. And in fact, I think you could use those ideals to analyze any number of current trends of injustice around the world and in the United States. The residential school emphasis on agricultural training, education, and conversion to Christianity, they all fit this pattern. But forced assimilation could only be viewed as moral and good from that horrible vantage point of superiority. Unfortunately, the settlers of North America never lacked that character trait. Captain Richard H. Pratt, who was the founder and a superintendent of the infamous Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, gave a speech in 1892 that showed how a person could justify even the most cruel actions springing from blatantly racist and white supremacist views under the guise of paternalistic generosity and care. And just as a warning, these are horrible statements. I'm going to share them because I think it's really important for understanding the context of the residential schools. But I feel awful reading them, and I just want you to be aware of what's coming. Pratt started his speech by saying, "A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one, and that high sanction of his destruction has been an enormous factor in promoting Indian massacres. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man." Amazingly and horrifyingly, Pratt, in his speech, would then use the enslavement of Africans as a positive example of how assimilation could work. Rather than recognize the courage, persistence, creativity, and love that has always marked Black resistance to slavery and its descendants from Jim Crow to mass incarceration, Pratt gave all the credit to the white people who enslaved them. In Pratt's view, his words, the care and authority of individuals of the higher race was a blessing in disguise. He said, "Horrible as were the experiences of slavery itself, there was concealed in them the greatest blessing that ever came to the Negro race, 7 millions of Blacks from cannibalism in darkest Africa to citizenship in free and enlightened America." This was Captain Richard H. Pratt, a pillar of his community, a man who was well thought of and regarded as a moral, good person who was entrusted with the founding and superintendence of a school. So what did he have to say about those schools? In contrast to his observations on slavery, Pratt saw the wars fought against Native peoples and concluded that forced assimilation was much more effective. He said, "We have never made any attempt to civilize Native peoples with the idea of taking them into the nation, and all of our policies have been against citizenizing and absorbing them. Boarding schools were his answer. It is a great mistake to think that the Indian is born an inevitable savage," he would say in his speech. "He is born a blank, like all the rest of us. Transfer the infant white to the savage surroundings, he will grow to possess a savage language, superstition, and habit. Transfer the savage-born infant to the surroundings of civilization, and he will grow to possess a civilized language and habit." That is what white supremacy looks like and sounds like dressed up in a schoolmaster's robes. The unmistakable goal was to eliminate indigenous nations, communities, customs, languages, and life. The official roots of the residential schools in the U.S. go back to 1819, when Congress passed the Civilization Fund Act. Its stated goal was stopping the decline and final extinction of the Indian tribes by, again, in the Act's words, introducing them to the habits and arts of civilization. The name of the Act already demonstrates and betrays their commitment to forced assimilation, with the settlers' ways assumed to be civilized and superior to any others. However, those early schools were mainly operated within Native communities, and some of those communities believed, or at least hoped, that they could take advantage of those schools to slow down colonization or mute its brutality. Instead, the powers that be just became frustrated that forced assimilation wasn't progressing as quickly as they had planned. The demand for removing children increased, and Grant's 1869 peace policy was part of that growing shift toward residential or boarding schools. A parallel movement was happening in Canada. The emphasis on saving Native peoples by converting them is clearly seen in both nations, as is the elevation of the missionary as a heroic figure, the literal embodiment of a white savior. This shift is demonstrated in no less than Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, who said in 1883, "When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages. He's surrounded by savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence, and the only way to do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools where they will acquire the habits and modes and thought of white men." You can see very clearly that in the minds of these leaders of this movement, assimilation required the removal of the children's cultural identities, such as forcing them to wear uniforms instead of their native dress, forbidding the speaking of native languages, cutting their braids. To be effective, the schools tried to traumatize as many children as possible so that cultural transmission would be broken generationally. They wouldn't be able to pass these things on to others. Hundreds of thousands of children were forced to attend schools in the United States. The percentage of, I don't know the exact numbers, but the percentage of Native children in residential schools rose to over 80% in 1926. In Canada, we estimate that over 150,000 children were required to attend these state-funded Christian schools. The schools are a powerful and tragic reminder of how oppression often comes in layers. The schools themselves constituted violence, a direct and intentional attack on Native peoples and cultures. They should have never, ever existed. But once there, children were regularly exposed to physical, verbal, and sexual abuse, as well as structural violence such as malnutrition and lack of health care, and cultural violence, like I mentioned, the cutting of their braids or forbidding them from speaking their native languages. All the while, these children mattered so little to the authorities that proper records weren't even kept. In Canada, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission spent around 8 years from 2008 to 2015 investigating their residential schools, and their findings offer insight into what happened and how so many children died. Leslie Young of Global News summarized the findings. First, she said, the number of deaths were likely much higher than we'll probably ever know. For example, students who became sick and were sent home died at home, and those deaths are not included. Of the 3,200 deaths that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission investigated, the commission reported that officials did not even record a name of the child who died for 1/3 of the deaths, or a cause of death for half of those who passed away. Even so, Young reported that, quote, Indigenous children in residential schools died at far higher rates than other Canadian children, even for the time. According to the report, many children died from infectious diseases, in particular tuberculosis, fires in school buildings, suicide, drowning, and other accidental causes. Additionally, we know that nutritional experiments in which Native children were purposely malnourished and in some cases fed an experimental flour mixture that was illegal in the rest of Canada were performed in Canadian residential schools in the 1940s. We also know that at least one doctor assisted by a nurse performed medical experiments on Native children in the 1950s. And those experiments resulted in deafness and left the victims and their families with terror that those families still remember to this day. Moreover, compulsory attendance at boarding schools did not end in the United States until 1978, when the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed, or in Canada until 1996, when the last school was closed. Even then, the system merely shifted to other ways of forced assimilation that they had discovered over time, especially placing Native children into foster and adoptive care in non-Native households. David Simmons of the National Indian Child Welfare Association described the shocking process. He said, there was very little work done to help the families rehabilitate, very little work done to really understand if there were any other family members who might be able to step in. And usually, the reasons they were given for removing children were flimsy compared to what we normally consider good practice and child safety. All of this history connects to the urgent needs of the present. There is a temptation to view the problems associated with forced assimilation in residential schools as it's all in the past, it's behind us. But that is a lie. And it's a lie that's very convenient for those in powerful, a lie that's very harmful to everyone, and a lie that's animated by imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. Alongside changing systems and structures, a cultural shift is needed to move away from all those attitudes and ideas that have fueled colonization, led to practices like forced assimilation, and continue to be embedded in our collective consciousness, and if we're honest, in our own minds, especially for us white folks. When you listen to the news, for example, listen through the lens of this history. When you hear about the ongoing resistance to pipelines being run through indigenous lands, don't separate it from the history of state-sponsored violence against Native peoples and the way they remove children from homes to break down, destabilize communities, and open up lands for settling. When you hear a story about how a Native American student is treated for wearing braids and they pop up in the news with regularity, remember this history of cultural genocide. When you learn that in South Dakota, a Native child is 11 times more likely to be removed from the home and placed in foster care than a white child, remember the ongoing legacy of forced removal and of residential schools. And when you grieve the children who are still living in concentration camps in the U.S. southern border, don't forget that this represents another instance of forcibly separating Native children from their families, and that according to lawyers, the process is even more complicated for Indigenous families who only speak one of the more than 100 Indigenous languages spoken by millions of people from Mexico to Honduras. We are repeating these mistakes again and again right now. Colonization, white supremacy, and other forms of domination rely on the exploitation of human beings and the earth itself in order to accumulate power and wealth in the hands of the few. These interlocking systems, they were never wise. They were never compassionate or moral or sustainable, and they now drive us to the edge of extinction. Gratefully, these oppressive systems are not the only traditions we have access to, not even in the West. And Indigenous peoples especially have courageously preserved and developed many other cultures that don't rely on domination. Especially for us white folks, our work of the present moment is to heal and to transform our collective consciousness, honoring the great web of life and finding our place within it. And to do that, we have to part ways with the sins of superiority, forced assimilation, and greed, learning that our own well-being can't be separated from the well-being of the diversity of humans and human cultures or from the earth itself. May it be so. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.